Please, round of applause for Hoda Afshar. Dr. Hoda Afshar. How'd you cast it? Here we go. Just, yeah. Shall we move a bit closer?
I apologize for the pain. For the pain. It's painful to watch. Even I pain every time I watch it. Yeah.
To call that confronting is an understatement. To call your work inspiring is an understatement. It is quite a bit to take in. And as much as we might be feeling certain feelings, I wanted to acknowledge that you spent hundreds of hours not just conducting those interviews, but then rewatching those interviews, cutting and editing, sound editing, constantly engaged with that for so long during a lockdown as well. That how many months of lockdown did you go through in total between here in the UK and back again?
I spent nearly 15 months in lockdown in the last 2 years. I did the whole Melbourne lockdown, and then it started right after I finished filming this project, and then I was sitting in lockdown transcribing 9 hours of interviews with the whistleblowers and going through it over and over, which I don't think was very healthy for my mind to do. But then I went to the UK for an artist residency, and then I got trapped in there for 7 months in lockdown. I returned hotel quarantine a month later here in Australia. We went back into lockdown again. So it's good to be free.
I just wanted to acknowledge and give another round of applause for the resilience it takes to be able to conduct a project like that.
Thank you.
Resilience is something we're going to probably talk about a bit in this session, but I wanted to start with how the idea to begin the photography project and then the film project came to you to begin with.
Sure. Most of my work is, I work with photography and film, and all of it is around like investigating how image making historically has contributed to the construction of different categories of marginality, and the visual languages that we use are often developed by imperial languages that continues to divide people, or just it's very hierarchical. So it's more like thinking about different methodologies and including collaboration to talk about, issues as such, social injustices, without reducing people to violence and trauma. So I worked with different communities and groups of people, and as you mentioned earlier, in 2018 I went to Manus Island to work with the refugees who were detained by the Australian government there. And I collaborated with Behruz Buchani, who's the journalist and writer. He was detained there at the time as well. And we made a film and also a photographic series with the men who were detained there at the time. And I remember the last night that I was on Manus, I asked the men that, did anybody who worked here for the Australian immigration system complain about the conditions of the camp and the treatment of the refugees? And they said in the first couple of years, anyone who complained about the situation were sent off immediately back to Australia. They were threatened with 2 years jail time, and they started only hiring people who would actually go along with the system without trying to resist it or change it. At first, when I heard it, I couldn't believe it, that something like that can exist in a liberal democratic system. And when I returned, I looked into it, and then I realized there's this law, the confidentiality, that people who work for any governmental organization have to sign it, and if they speak about the government's wrongdoing, they face jail time. So it became, the starting point for the project. At first, I looked into people who worked in the detention center because I wanted to make this work as a kind of a mirrored image of the project on Manus Island. One of the things I was testing also at the time with the project I did on Manus was to see what it takes for people here in Australia to hear these people, because at the time there were kids under the age of 10 in Nauru that were committing suicide, because of the psychological trauma that the system put them through. And even that wasn't enough to convince people to do something about it. There were a smaller population who were, vocal about the situation and active, but it was never enough. And so I was wondering what, maybe if people do not respond to the men and women who are outside the Australian border, the migrants, the so-called refugees, maybe they respond to their own people, the Australians who actually witnessed that and tried to do something about it. The idea of people who witnessed other people's trauma and they carry it within their bodies, like the body becomes a museum that preserves and archives other people's traumas. So I wanted to capture that, but then going into the project, the more I heard about other practices like the youth detention centers and then the disability sector, and then I got in contact with Bernard Collaery, who's the guy at the end of the film. He's a celebrity lawyer of human rights, and he worked with Witness K as a lawyer because he defended Witness K. He's facing jail time too. Or David McBride, who was the lawyer of the Australian Defence Force in Afghanistan, and he leaked 400 secret documents to ABC because he risked his life basically for the sake of public to know that the Defence Force is covering up for the killing of innocent Afghanis. And he's facing lifetime imprisonment, and ABC was raided because of his documents in 2019. So the project started growing bigger and bigger to a point that at some point I felt like I'm breaking under it because it comes with a lot of responsibility. But it was important for me to bring all these different narratives together because all of these people went to the media at some point and they risked their lives thinking the public needs to know, and if the public knows, they would do something about it. I related to that experience because that's what I did with the Manus project, and then you realize that the public chooses to actively remain blind to it, as one of the people in the film talks about it. So it's the essence of tragedy to me, the people who are caught between the law and morality, and they choose the public and the morality, but then they lose everything over it. So I thought if people are encountering these narratives in the paper or the media as a single story, maybe they don't realize the depth of the problem there. But if they see it all together, it highlights something about the fragile state of democracy in this country, and they may react to it differently.
Has that been the case? How's the response been so far?
The response has been great, but unfortunately it coincided with lockdown after lockdown that the show's been cancelled. The first exhibition was when I was in London, and I wasn't here when it was shown in Melbourne, that we put the photographic work on large billboards in Federation, across the road from Federation Square, and the film was shown in a building across the road, and people were sending images to me of public standing around these billboards with the text of the narratives of each individual and having a conversation about it, which was really exciting to see.
Beautiful. I was going to ask you a little bit about the selection as well. How did you come to find and meet and select each of the people that you photographed and filmed?
It was interesting. At first I was talking to Behruz Bouchani about who to work with from Manus Island, and then he kept telling me that it's very important that you work with the right people, because at some point there were a lot of people who worked for the immigration. They benefited from it. They earned so much money. They offer so much money to people who worked in those detention centers, and they benefited from it. And at the end of their time, they felt guilty, and they decided to go out and get more recognition for speaking out while they actually financially benefited from the system. So he was warning me about making sure that the people I choose are like people who had, genuine intention about it. It's a very difficult decision to make, basically. But I collaborated with the researcher from Melbourne University, Claire Loughnane, and she is in the area of criminology and social justice, and her last 10 years of research been on whistleblowing and the detention centers and so on. So she helped me a lot in finding the right people. And then I got in contact with Mark Davis, who's the lawyer of lots of the whistleblowers in Australia, including, what's his name, the WikiLeaks guy. Yeah, Julian Assange. And he's the lawyer of Julian Assange too, and he put me in contact with most of the people that I worked with, yeah.
Incredible. Can you talk us a little bit through the process, your creative process, and why you decided to sculpt and photograph people the way you did, and then to shoot them in that particular style as well, because it's very intentional, obviously.
You know, I thought I want people to directly feel the pain and trauma that is in the body of these people and how it affected the individuals. Basically mocking the language of documentary filmmaking in the cases where, like, often if the documentarian wants to keep the identity of the subject hidden, they get really close to the subject and to they do tight crops. I remember I watched a documentary on the ghost of Abu Ghraib, the prison in Iraq, and that was the greatest inspiration behind this, actually, where they were interviewing the inmates, the people who were tortured by the American soldiers and humiliated. I don't know if you know about the controversy of the images that leaked, and they were interviewing the inmates, but they were like hiding their identities, and it was very tight close-ups of their faces and hands and the ears, and when they were talking about their experiences in the prison and they were breaking into tears and so on, it was very effective. I wanted to use that visual language. Often I try to use the conventions of documentary but try to challenge it as well. What's the truth in it? So I use that here as well to first of all highlight the fact that if you want to tell the truth, you have to remain anonymous as a whistleblower, but then also to, like, by sharp cuts and jumps, I wanted to highlight the montage aspect, that the truth is constructed, but then I wanted to also stitch all the different pieces of these people's bodies together to present the story as one body, which to me is the body of the society in pain.
And I think some people might be familiar with the photography exhibition, but you went through a fair bit of work to actually come up with those photographs as well. Can you talk us through that part of it? The
portraits that I made of the whistleblowers. Yeah. The project has a second component, which is a series of portraits I made of the men, and I used 3D scanning technology, but I worked with a 3D expert who had 110 cameras installed, and we were clicking one click and 110 cameras were firing at the same time and documenting all the details of the faces of the subject. And the only thing that the 3D technology couldn't record was the details of their eyes, which to me was referencing the identity recognition tools like iris scanning and so on. But then also the 110 cameras to me was a way of talking about the overexposure of the media, but also the surveillance as the struggle of the people here in the West, to me, is the opposite of the struggle of most minorities like the refugees. They struggle with visibility. I wanted to highlight their identities by bringing them forward. But here, we always struggle with too much visibility. We're just constantly being monitored everywhere we go through the surveillance cameras and technology, so we want to become less visible. So in some ways I wanted to bring those ideas into the work, and later the 3D scans that I made of the faces, I modeled them into Greek busts, and they look like Greek statues, printed them 3D and then rephotographed them as museum objects. And so there are layers of the faces and identity that is removed, but by doing that, I wanted to reference the earlier formation of democracy, in Athenian democracy and also Greek tragedy, which were all both shaping and happening at the same time.
Beautiful. So much thought has gone into this. I want to ask you a little bit about the situation you're really investigating there, and the interviews you conducted is a really extreme juxtaposition of the extreme resilience and strength that was necessary to be able to bring these stories out, and then the extreme active silence that was mentioned as well, where like they're literally face to face with these atrocities, and so many people are actively silent. Whereas in wider society, we might be seeing a not quite contrasted example of the same thing, where there's still active silence and there is still resilience, but it's not quite as extreme. So you actually went to the very source of this inequity, and you saw the extremes of active silence and resilience. Can you speak to us a little bit about why you think this function of active silence is such a big part of our society, whether it's Australian, whether you think it's a global thing? Why do you think active silence is something that comes up so often in these sorts of spaces?
To be honest, I'm trying to find an answer to that question through making these works, because that's initially what inspires me to make it. I don't make work about things that I know or have a knowledge of. I make work about things that I don't know. So through the process of making, I want to understand the matter better. And then what I discover along the way, I share it with others. And I think the works are creating more questions than answering anything, because I wanted, first of all, for people to feel the discomfort and to be faced with our own complicity. And also to, when you watch this, I want you to ask yourself that, what would you do if you were in that situation? Because most of the problems we are facing in relation to social injustices is because the majority choose to remain silent or to remain oblivious to it. It's too much. It's not my pain. I have enough of my own, But I think we all have to acknowledge that people like us, we all have our own struggles, but we are still some of the most privileged people in the world, and part of that privilege has to be shared. And I feel that responsibility, but I want to know that why the majority don't. And I think at some point I see it a lot in like the way that these narratives are pictured and imaged and narrated. And as I said, for me, years of studying the role of images in communicating stories as such as very significant, because they know the way that, for example, we image certain narratives, it's like to normalize their pain. For us today, you know, the Palestinians' death is normalized, the Syrians' death is normalized. If we see an American dying, we react to it very differently than seeing masses of people in Palestine and Syria dying. So it is because of the way that they're imaged and the way that these stories are shared, and we kind of became numb towards others' suffering, especially, you know, people of color and so on, and the so-called third world or the conflict zones. So it's the way that we value these lives, the way that we understand and relate to it. So I think what I'm trying to do is to reverse that to a certain degree in the visual language, or find a way that make people feel things, because we're oversaturated by images of suffering to a point that we feel completely detached from the suffering of others. Yeah.
Thank you, Hoda John. Please, round of applause for Dr. Hoda Afshar.
Thank you.